Okay, we'll go ahead and get started for our Planning Commission meeting tonight. Start the recorder here for Kim. And if you would all rise, and I'll read the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, we have got, the first item of business is 3 meetings of minutes to talk about and discuss if there's any comments. If not, we'll need to make a motion to approve. Any questions on the 3 meetings? Had 2 of those in February.
Sure, I was at all 3 of those before I.
Yeah.
Looks like it was.
I reviewed those and didn't have any changes.
Okay. Do you want?
I'll make a motion that we approve the February 6th, February 26th, and April 10th Planning Commission minutes.
Got a motion from Commissioner Euler
I'll second it.
and a second from Commissioner Argyle. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. The next thing is Title 15 amendments. The first thing on the agenda is the billboard amendments.
Just have a couple things for you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. This was discussed in your meeting last month, and from that meeting, staff took a few homework assignments. So to report back on those, Planning Commission asked us to notice property owners that have property the billboards are located on of the process that we're going through now to potentially change the billboard regulations. We've done that. The Planning Commission asked us to provide a count relative to the number of billboards that exist today in Spanish Fork. We've done that. That's part of the inventory that was provided to you with the materials that were delivered last week. And we were asked to explore the possibility or maybe the advisability of developing some type of bank for signed copy area or something like that relative to billboards. And that's been discussed with our folks here. And in short, given what we're trying to accomplish with the proposed changes and what we really think are best practices that other cities have employed relative to simply regulating billboards, we don't think that's probably something that is in the city's best interest to do at this time.
Is not to do that.
Is to not do that.
Okay.
So that being said, I don't think there have really been any substantial changes or substantive, even I'd say, changes made to what was presented to the commission last month. We'd certainly be happy to answer any questions that you might have of us about any of the things that I just mentioned or anything else relative to what we're hoping to accomplish with the proposal or anything else for that matter.
Okay. So the inventory that was done on it looks like there was, what, 23
23. Yes.
billboards, and you got pictures of all of them, and it's comments of who owned them, and the condition was even noted in most,
Right.
if not all. There was 2 or 3 on the last part of it that showed that they was removed, mostly out towards the road going to Salem. So they're non-existent right now.
They're not right now. There are certainly rights to those billboards that exist, so from our perspective, they're part of the inventory. And we recognize them as such. We think they'll be replaced somehow, and we're working with the owners of those billboards to somehow make that happen.
And that could be either in the same location or a different location?
Potentially in a different location. And I should say this, We've talked with, it's Reagan Outdoor Advertising that owns those, about everything from the city potentially buying them, so they'd go away, to relocating them, basically, I would say on-site, as if they were just moved, maybe a few dozen feet further to the east, to locating them on other properties. And we continue to have those conversations with them, but we certainly understand that there are rights associated with those, so they're
Okay.
part of our inventory.
All right. And you mentioned that all of the people that had involvement with billboards was notified about this meeting.
We sent them all a letter, yeah, I believe it was the week before last, so
Appreciate the staff working on those action items for us.
happy to do it, that's all pretty easy.
So last month, we did have a public hearing. I don't think it means that we couldn't have another one tonight, especially if we've got some citizens that would like to comment on it. Before we go into public hearing, though, is there any questions or comments from the commissioners?
Yeah, so I had one more, and that is, we had talked about them being non-conforming and making them all become non-conforming. Was there any more update on that, Dave?
My short answer is no.
No, he's right about that. We can, our ultimate goal is this, to put a cap one way or another on it.
A cap
On the
on,
amount of billboards that are in the city. I think there are 2 or 3 in the process. They're the 3 that were mentioned that are down on South Main. Those are currently not in existence. I'm not sure if the poles are even there, but
Okay.
those will be replaced or something will happen with those. So those will not ultimately reduce any number unless we buy them out. But we have looked at either doing, making them non-conforming or putting a cap. And we figure non-conforming just is the easiest way to do that. Non-conforming does not mean that they are they're just limited in what they can do with them, but under the billboard rights that they have with the state, they do have quite a few rights that they can do things with them. They just can't expand them and things like that under non-conforming uses.
okay, so my question to you would be that if we can do it a different way so it's not non-conforming, it seems like if it has the branded title fill, like a car that's been branded, has a branded title, it's not as valuable, it's not worth as much on any way you analyze it if it has that branded status. So I think the people who own these would prefer not to have a branded status. So if we could take the path of not having a title called branded, I think that'd be better.
Billboard, I disagree with that. Billboards, billboards are not like cars at all. Billboards have a certain value, a very high value, regardless of what you call them. Non-conforming use doesn't put any bad value. It just means that the use is not conforming to whatever zone it's in. That's all that means. So it has nothing to do with like cars that are branded as salvaged or anything like that. It's not the same thing. And so their value doesn't go down just because we call them non-conforming. Believe us, if we were buying billboards, that's not the case.
But last meeting, people who actually owned these, that's how they felt.
That's how they feel, and I disagree with that.
Okay, well, that's,
I really do.
that's fair. You can disagree with the
Because
people.
of the fact that when we do this and when we have to value these, an expert has to come in, an appraiser that does billboards. There's only a few that do it. These aren't like buying a house. It's not the same kind of thing. So appraisers that do houses are different. Appraisers that do billboards, they look for certain things. Just because they're non-conforming or conforming, I don't think that has anything to do with it, to be honest with you.
So if we had one of
It's
those
what the
billboard,
value is and what the potential value is.
so your opinion, if we had a billboard appraiser in this room tonight, he would say it doesn't make any hill beans
I don't
difference.
think it does.
Well, that's what you're saying he would say, right? Or she?
Oh, I can't speak for any appraisers. I cannot.
Oh, okay. In your opinion, they wouldn't.
My opinion, yes, that's true.
Was the option to either put a limit or to make them non-conforming. Is that what you said?
Yeah, David kind of explained last time while I was here, and I admit that I had to go to Salem for another meeting, but David mentioned that we thought in our code that that's what we were doing to begin with. Apparently, that is not the case, and we had to revise, and that's where we were looking. One way or another, we'd like to put the cap on it.
You guys have a number?
Did
Did the city come up with a physical number that they'd like to cap it at?
The current number that's out there plus the two or three that are in the process.
That sounds like
If you were
about
to
20.
leave it at a cap rather than the non-conforming, does that change if, for example, a billboard goes down? You've already set the cap at a specific number. Does that mean then that that billboard could be moved somewhere else where even after a year or whatever the code change was, where after a year, if it's not been replaced, it's gone, it comes off the books?
Yeah, that would be harder to do. What we'd have to do is we'd have to try to spell it out in the ordinance. If you make them non-conforming, they have their options. They can either move it, as our code says they can, to another place and another location. Now, if that location cannot be located, then we actually have to condemn them.
But doesn't it say in there, Jason, that if somebody takes one down, just takes it down, then does that take our limit down too? I mean, just.
It would. If they took it down, for instance, let's step aside from Reagan, what Reagan's
Putting
doing.
it back up anywhere, then that takes our number down.
Right. We have, and I don't recall in the code what it says, but I think there's a year period. Is that what it is?
That's what we talked about.
And just to be
I don't know if
clear,
that's state law or if that's in the code.
that's state law relative to non-conforming uses. And I don't want there to be any misunderstanding about where staff's coming from on this. Absolutely, it is to limit the number of billboards in Spanish Fork. From our perspective, having 20, that's better than 23. Having 15 is better than 20. So I don't want to mince words at all about that. And we're completely coming at this from the perspective of what's best for Spanish Fork.
Is there just
There, sorry.
Go ahead.
There are rights associated with billboards that are clearly defined. I think they're defined in state law. They're defined relative to how cases have played out over the years. I think we understand well what those are. And we have every intention of respecting those moving forward. So questions about what you can do with a non-conforming use, whether it's a billboard or something else, I think they've all become very well understood with the specific doctrine that's been developed over a lot of time. And again, we will certainly respect that moving forward regardless of what happens here. But again, we are coming at this from the perspective of what's best for the city.
So I don't have an opinion really. I'm just trying to understand what the city's view is. Is the city's perception that billboards are an eyesore or they're negative for the city? What is it specifically that the city views that less is better?
Now, I can't speak for the city, right? So this is Dave Anderson speaking, and really maybe nothing more than that. Although I do think on the part of staff, we feel pretty similarly about some things. From my perspective, the biggest concern with billboards is what cities find themselves doing when there is an issue with a billboard. Just in our last meeting with the city council, we had an attorney come and be very clear about how costly it would be for the city to deal with billboards if we maybe make a misstep, or if we do choose to condemn a billboard or do different things like that. There is a genuine, real financial liability that cities deal with every billboard in the community. And that is something we get reminded of regularly as we meet with the folks that have billboards. Relative to aesthetics and different things like that, and again, that's very subjective. I absolutely think there is a place for billboards in the world. I think they serve a purpose and that there's a need for them. Again, speaking for myself, I think 23 is a great number for Spanish Fork. I think 15 probably is a better number. Yes, I wouldn't, if there is some attrition over time, I don't think the community is going to be any worse off for that. And in some ways, Spanish Fork's going to be better. So that's just my perspective. But again, I think we're kind of on the same page as staff.
Yeah, I agree. It's very, very costly. In fact, in the Development Review Committee meeting, it was mentioned, well, if you guys are going to condemn these and start buying these out, which could be something that has to happen. If it does, it's not going to be cheap. These things they're not cheap. So, you know, it's something we don't want to be in court for several years going down the road of trying to condemn or trying to pay for these. We're just trying to get the number down as best we can, and the easiest way to do that is just to put this, make them non-conforming and put a limit on the amount that's currently here. They can do what they need to do, and they can still advertise and do that stuff. As of today, and then going forward, they just, once one goes down and stays down for a year, then no longer would that one be acceptable.
Okay.
Got another question too about one of the changes. Prior code or current existing code is 500 feet from a residential, no, 400. The new one has it bumped up to 500. Is there a reason why that extra 100 feet?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of one Wasatch Front. When they start getting into residential neighborhoods or near residential neighborhoods, the older ones probably not as much as the newer version. The lighted versions that have the changing panels, you drive by them and they, not triggered by cars by any means, but you see them switch the image on them.
Digital.
Those are electronic, and because of that, they emit a certain amount of light off of them, and the changes, when they change over to the next image, they will emit light pollution, if you will. When they're close to residential, you get a lot of complaints about stuff like that. Usually, if you look around Spanish Fork, for the most part, they're not anywhere near those. And the ones that have been, we've successfully negotiated with them as far away as possible from houses. And so as Spanish Fork continues to grow, that's where we'll start to get into those issues as houses start popping up in areas that they haven't traditionally been. I-15 will probably remain there for a good long time, so I don't think there'll be any issues. But we may have housing eventually out toward that Benjamin exit on the north east side of it.
So if this change goes in, we wouldn't be allowing any new billboards anyways, so this would only apply or affect billboards that come down and are trying to relocate.
Yeah, basically the idea would be that would be a no-no. We couldn't relocate there, but there might be, for instance, another location possibly that we could move it. And we would try to work with the billboard company and see if that's what we could come up with. And like I said, a couple of years ago, that was what we were able to move one from Highway 51, I believe, and I may be wrong on this, but I think it moved to Highway 6.
Is the city concerned at all about if these changes go in and a billboard needs to get moved and we've limited any locations within the city where it can actually be moved, and so it would have to go away? Are they worried about any litigation with that?
Somewhat, but I mean, it's a reality that you have to, when you go down this road, that's the reality you have to live with. There is plenty of case law on this stuff. I mean, a lot. And that's why the code gives, Utah code actually gives billboard companies and billboard owners a lot of rights that normal companies may not enjoy because of, most cities have the same kind of feel for them. They don't want them near residential areas, and residential starts to creep closer and closer to certain areas. And it's the problem that most cities are facing.
Okay.
All my questions.
All your questions? Okay, thank you, Jason. Since we do have some new people here that wasn't here last meeting, we'll go into a public hearing and give those an opportunity to come up and ask any questions or comments. No. Is there anyone from the public that would like to make a comment on the billboards? Okay, seeing none, we will close the public hearing. And commissioners, do we have any other questions or somebody,
Surprises me.
yeah,
There were quite a few last month, but yeah, I'm surprised as well. Yeah.
what's that? Maybe.
Okay, we give them all,
Does the commissioners have any other dialogue in this, or is there a feeling for a recommendation or a motion?
I think we obviously know what the city wants, so it's whether, I'll be curious to see, follow the discussion in city council and see how they,
This will be on the city council agenda for next Tuesday, I believe. For public hearing. Is that right, Dave? Next Tuesday?
We've advertised for a public hearing then, yeah, so that.
This is a recommendation to the city council then, right?
Correct.
We'll make a motion that we recommend to city council the approvals of the Title 5 and 15 changes on the billboards.
Got a motion from Commissioner Davis. Do we have a second?
I'm struggling.
Are you?
Yeah, I am, because obviously I understand what the city wants, but I don't know, in a way, still I feel like you are penalizing property owners for this. So, I don't know.
so I'm a nay. I'll be a nay if you want to vote, go ahead. But I'll
So
be a nay.
I'll second Richard's motion. So we got a first and a second. Let's do a verbal roll call, starting with Richard.
Aye.
Nay?
Aye.
Nay.
Okay, so we're a split decision on this. If you'll just, of course, the records will show that for the council that, and it sounds like, as far as a message to the council, if I'm going to speak for both commissioners, that they're concerned about property rights, potential devaluation, et cetera.
Yeah, just
Is that
a
the
non-conforming
spirit?
status. If the city can make a proposal that doesn't put everybody into default non-conforming status, they can be conforming because they've been here for years. Just seems odd to me that somebody's been conforming for a whole bunch of years, we're gonna change something and make them all non-conforming. It just doesn't sit right with me for some reason.
Okay,
Not sure why.
So you're saying that it's going to drop their property value? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying it possibly could because the people that represent the design company's last meeting, they felt like it would. The city doesn't feel like it would, and I don't have an appraiser here to tell me what his real opinion is, a professional. And I really can't see why we would make somebody non-conforming who's been conforming for the last 50 years. That just seems odd to me.
That's how I feel.
so we'll let
So let the
Dave
city,
carry that message to the council.
let the council decide.
They can digest it, okay. Last item on the agenda is accessory apartments. Hey, you guys, none of you stood up here. Okay. Well, thanks for coming.
We're all here for that, didn't we?
Yeah, I don't get it.
No comments, but they wanted to listen.
I feel like some other people might be, right? And to talk about that, I really appreciate on this next item, the involvement that we've had from the community on some questions that we've asked. And the questions have had to do with how Spanish Fork City regulates accessory apartments. Accessory apartments, by definition, is a second dwelling unit on a property where the property owner resides on the property. So I want to be really clear about that to start with, and you guys that have sat through this a few times, I apologize, but I will try to be brief. But I think that's a really big deal, and I think that needs to be emphasized, that we are talking about a program that we currently have that allows for that use, again, an apartment basically is what we allow today. A lot of times they're in a basement. Think of it maybe as mother-in-law apartments or different things like that, where the owner resides on the property. Now, that's very different, in my opinion, and it's different relative to how we define that use from duplexes, which could be the exact same use, if you will, 2 families, 1 property, but the owner doesn't reside there with a duplex. And simply put, I think it's been Spanish Fork's experience and that of other communities. In fact, I haven't found a community yet that has had a different experience where neighborhoods with a high density of duplexes fare as well in terms of how they age, the care of properties, the amount of turnover relative to the residents in those neighborhoods and things like that, as neighborhoods where there's a high density of single-family detached homes with accessory apartments. They just seem to work differently, and the neighborhoods with the accessory apartments, based on maybe some metrics that I would throw out there again, just in terms of aesthetics, maintenance, the impact that they have on the community, things like schools, property values, typically they fare better with accessory apartments and that ownership component than you get with duplexes. So tonight, all we want to talk about, all we're proposing that we talk about, again, are accessory apartments.
On a single-family dwelling lot.
Exactly, yes. That's another good thing to clarify. Right now, we allow accessory apartments in a few zones. I'll talk in a second about how we're proposing that that be changed. We have some criteria for accessory apartments that we're proposing to be changed. And this is coming about because staff believes that right now our regulations are more strict than they need to be. So we're proposing that they be loosened or broadened. And let me talk for just a second about how we got here. We have been discussing this with the Planning Commission and the City Council for well over a year. In fact, it was early in 2018 that the City Council, in a formal meeting, said, Dave, figure out how we need to change this. And I wouldn't typically celebrate taking more than a year to do something that the City Council tells me to do, but I really appreciate the fact that we've been very deliberate in putting together what we'll talk about here in just a second. And this is simple, by the way. I mean, this is not going to be, I think, a surprise for any of you and earth-shattering, but I think the time has been a good investment for everybody because we have had some input from the community that I don't think we entirely anticipated that's helped us craft this a little bit differently than how it would have been presented in early 2018. And that inputs come via some, I think, very strong survey work that our public information person did. We had some conversations with different groups of residents that volunteered their time to come and give us their thoughts about the issue, focus groups. And we certainly learned some things from that were a surprise to me. And we've had input from you as the Planning Commission and the City Council. And I'll talk about how that's very directly influenced what we'll talk about here in just a minute. So the time that we've spent, I think, will make what changes may happen have greater longevity than maybe they otherwise would have. We really hope that this is a concept that the community can embrace more broadly than how maybe it otherwise would have. And we understand, and we particularly understand this was reaffirmed as we asked folks questions and as they responded to surveys and things. We know that not everybody likes the idea of having an accessory apartment in their neighborhood. And we respect that. And we get complaints from time to time about accessory apartments. So certainly part of the effort has been to balance two potentially very distinct perspectives and to come up with something that will work and that will hopefully have a negligible impact. I mean, ideally, with loosening the regulations, people won't feel like their neighborhoods are changing. We will test that somehow over the years and try to see just how the community feels about any changes that might have been made and whether they've been a positive or a negative. With that all being said, boy, I had a wingman here. He was all ready to shoot for me. And I know we had a power issue a minute ago. So, plan B. We've had some information posted on the city's website for a little over a week, and we had a Facebook post, and I'm just going to regurgitate what we have there because it's a pretty good summary of, I think, the things that are most important to you. I mentioned to start with that right now we allow accessory apartments in a fairly limited part of the community, and it really is the originally platted areas, these square blocks, you know, maybe 10th east over to, I want to say about 8th or 9th west, you know, down to maybe 4th south, up to 10th north, you know, that area, which is predominantly zoned R16 or R3, which are the two zones where today we allow accessory apartments. And we're simply proposing that accessory apartments be permitted in all of the R1 and the R3 zone in the city. So that would include everything up to the R115 zone, I think. I may want to double check that. Certainly includes the R112 zone. And in essence, all of the parts of the community that are zoned for single-family homes today. That's kind of the geographical change that we're proposing. And again, that proposal really is the direct result of some of the feedback that we've received. And another thing that I want to acknowledge, yet I almost want to downplay it. A part of why we're talking about this certainly is the fact that there are accessory apartments today in every zone of the city. We have a code enforcement issue today. So part of the question that we originated with is it better for the community to try to compel people to stop using their properties in such a way that, you know, has been illegal? Or does it make sense to maybe make some changes to make some of those uses legal? And again, we're arriving now at the point of recommending that it makes more sense in our view, because we don't view them really as being a negative, to make things more legal. Yet, with the different parameters that we'll talk about, with or without visual aids, not every property in the city will qualify or will be practical for use as a single-family dwelling with an accessory apartment. And
Even though we've covered, or you've covered all the zones, some just still
yeah,
won't
so
be.
for example, we think that for a variety of different reasons, with the step that should be made now, there should still be a minimum lot size. So we're recommending that that be reduced from about 10,000 square feet, which is what it's been for 12 or 15 years, down to 8,000 square feet. As we've looked at different arrangements, we think that's enough space to accommodate, it's primarily parking.
Mhm.
That,
Yeah,
and
makes
which incidentally was the hot topic and the biggest source of potential concern for folks when it came to accessory apartments. And that being said, that isn't necessarily, I think, as well, a magic number. But from our perspective, it's a practical change to make. And we're recommending that now. There are probably some folks in town that have 6,000 square foot lots that think they should be allowed to have accessory apartments on. And simply put, if things were adopted the way they're proposed now,
They
they
wouldn't.
wouldn't qualify. And I know that there will be some of those conversations, regardless of how things end up getting sorted out, that we'll have with people still. But again, we're really trying to
Yeah.
be as permissive as what makes sense. So the geography, the lot size, another big deal for folks over time has been impact fees. And the way the code reads today simply requires that impact fees be paid for accessory apartments as if you were building any other multifamily unit in the community. So as if you're building maybe a townhome or an apartment of some other type, we require those impact fees to be paid. And we are suggesting now to staff that the city will be fine if we don't charge impact fees for accessory apartments. In fact, I would say this, that in terms of getting people to comply voluntarily with an accessory apartment program, maybe to come out of the shadows into the light, and to make it so that we can recognize properties as legal properties with accessory apartments, I think impact fees have been an extreme impediment for people. I won't know the exact number, but we're talking probably $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. That is simply a check that somebody has to cut to the city in order to today be able to submit plans in the city, to have an accessory apartment approved for their property.
So those, the proposal is to do away with those?
So to no longer charge impact fees.
Okay.
Exactly. We could spend a lot of time talking about that, and there's certainly different opinions about the purpose of impact fees.
Does that have anything to do with registration or licensing?
Let's talk about that next. I don't think
Okay.
it does necessarily.
Okay.
But one thing that I believe is very important in terms of being able to manage our accessory apartment program better than we have in the past. I think our management, frankly, has been very, very poor in the past, is to have some record of who has accessory apartments that are recognized by the city as being legal. And in fact, I think that's something that property owners value. I don't know exactly how that would come about, but one concept is that property owners are given an opportunity to, again, have the city recognize their property as a home with an accessory apartment, which incidentally we've already done some of over time with different written correspondence that we give people because maybe their lender requires a letter from the city saying that accessory apartment's legal, or those sorts of things. Our thought is that we develop that registry more robustly, and that basically becomes a public document unless somebody for some reason doesn't want their name included. So when a lender calls us to say, hey, I'm doing a second mortgage on this property, I need to know if that accessory apartment that they have is legal or not, we can refer them directly to maybe a list that we have on the website or something along those lines. Or if perhaps somebody is considering renting a basement apartment someplace and they're wondering if that's a legal dwelling in the city, same thing.
So this is a registration, not a license.
And probably it's the same either way.
How are we verbalizing it?
We've verbalized it both ways so many times. I'd kind of prefer to call it a registration than a license, because I don't really want to confuse it, for example, with a business license.
Yeah, I think it's a little softer.
And for me, it sounds that way, and so, but for that matter, I don't care.
Is
I don't
there,
think it
is there a proposed fee for the registration?
We haven't proposed it as part of this, but basically for the effort that we would put into it every year, it would be similar, frankly, to what we do for businesses, maybe home occupations that have patrons or that type of thing. We charge $60 a year for that.
So
And
is that in the proposal?
the proposal simply suggests that that amount gets defined by the city council with the budget that they adopt every year.
Okay, I
Which
guess-
is, we found a little bit better way to manage that over time than to include it in the ordinance.
Okay. But if someone asks, and it probably will come up, $60 is kind of a hip shot of what it may be.
If you're comfortable with the concept of a fee and the council's comfortable with the concept of a fee and what that would be used by the city to accomplish and what that would provide a property owner with, staff will recommend that it's $60.
Okay. And is that a one-time or annual?
That's an annual. Yep.
Okay.
Which,
The homeowner get for that $60 a year?
Basically, it's just the assurance that the city recognizes it as being legal over time. And what the city gets, I think, most importantly, is an opportunity on an annual basis to make sure that the accessory apartments, the properties that accessory apartments are being located on, maybe I should say, are being used as accessory apartments rather than duplexes. So a concern is that, in fact, some people feel very flippant about, I think, and very, they lack confidence in the city's ability to make sure that accessory apartments over time don't become duplexes. And I think the best assurance that we can give those folks is that, well, we're going to check every year. And part of that $60 is us doing research every year to make sure through some records that we have access to that the owner of the
Shows
property
the owner of the
resides
property.
there
resides there,
and that type of a thing. So those are the main things that I see as being beneficial.
okay. That seems reasonable.
And, you know, I'll say this as well. I don't like being a pioneer when it comes to land use matters. And we're not with what we're talking about today. I think we have used other communities' experience, and I think we've looked to the communities that we think have the best programs relative to ADUs or accessory apartments, and they're the model for what we're talking about now. So, and that includes the idea of having some license or a registration and kind of that annual check that happens. So that's certainly part of that as well.
Okay.
Building code things, and I feel all right now that we didn't invite John Little to come tonight. He got a night off. He's our building official, and one of the challenges, in fact, I would say perhaps the biggest challenge moving forward to work with folks to try to make their properties legal relates to building code requirements. And you know that when it comes to how we apply regulations and ordinances, bright lines mean a lot to us, meaning we really like to have very clear distinctions between what's legal and what's not legal. We absolutely strive to treat everybody the same way all the time. And with accessory apartments, because the situations are so distinct, we know we have to look at it a little bit differently. So for example, there would be different criteria that would come into play if Commissioner Argyle wanted to take his home, which is 15 or 20 years old maybe, we can just say, and add an accessory apartment to that. Then what would come into play if when Commissioner Davis wants to build a brand new home from the ground up and have an accessory apartment built into that home from the beginning? Or if somebody wanted to take a home, or let's say this more realistic scenario, maybe the most problematic scenario, somebody finished their basement with an accessory apartment 10 years ago illegally, didn't have it inspected. Now they qualify for everything, but we've got to try to sort out how we make sure that the wiring is safe and the plumbing, and the HVAC, and those different things. That would be looked at differently than, you know, the case I described, for example, with somebody building a new home from the ground up to where they're just simply different animals. I really appreciate the research that our building officials done to try to understand how we can be consistent while yet looking at some situations differently. But we know that's going to be a little bit tricky. And I'll say this, we want to make sure that things are safe, which from my perspective is part of the reason that we need to be very cognizant of how important it is to have a program that people want to voluntarily be a part of. We don't want people to feel a need to continue to stay, like I said, underground or, you know, to fly under the radar, because that I think just simply leads to a greater risk that there are housing situations in the community that probably are subpar. And that being said as well, relative to the building code things that we've talked about, I mean, we are concerned about the life safety things, making sure that people can get out of apartments, you know, in certain situations, making sure that, like I said, some of the fundamentals are addressed with as soft of a touch as we need to employ. So I think I might have hit most everything. The separate electric meter concept, that has also been a big deterrent. I don't understand necessarily all the ins and outs of how homes are wired, but I know there's some complexity there. I know the older the home, the greater likelihood that there is that it's more complicated. And the idea that you would try to parse out some of that to be able to have utilities metered differently on different units, that's a problem. And in fact, during the focus group discussions that we had several folks participate that have accessory apartments. And they explained how they work things out as landlords and tenants contractually. And they're very comfortable that that's a very acceptable way to do it. I think that's the best way to do it as well, so.
Yeah, that's a big one there. I'm sure that was high on the list of concerns,
Yep.
along with parking and impact fees. So, yeah, it
Got a
looks
lot
like,
of pushback over
it looks
the
like
years.
it's really been well thought out and made it much easier for people to conform.
And that's the hope. And we're talking about people's homes, and we're talking about some of the more fundamental things that we deal with as just families, your ability to pay for housing and have safe housing and those types of things. And I am not very interested in being really intrusive in, the choices people make and that sort of thing. But yet, we want to make sure that we're doing the appropriate things that make sure that when your neighbor has an accessory apartment, that doesn't negatively impact
Yeah.
you or how you choose to use your property or your property value and those things. So that's a much longer intro than I expected. I'll blame it maybe on our power outage. But those are the fundamental things that we're proposing be considered to be changed. One thing that we talked about that I need to close on, or at least mention, we've talked about the idea of potentially allowing accessory apartments that aren't in the same structure as the primary dwelling. And there's language that you can see in the report that we sent that would open that door. We have not in the past allowed that. So that would be, for example, and I'll say this because I've said it before, sometimes, for example, I've seen in St. George where there's a guest house in the backyard that is completely separate from the main home, has a kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, and it literally is a distinct dwelling unit. Many communities allow those to serve as accessory dwelling units that can be rented out to different families, just as if it was your basement, but set up differently. And as we've talked about that concept, again, we've authored some language that would make that legal and make it legal from staff's perspective in a way that it would have the least likelihood to negatively impact a neighbor, maybe is what makes sense. But we feel at this time that there's likely to be enough pushback on that maybe that's part of the concept that's worth just setting aside, maybe to circle back to at a later date. And we'd love to get any feedback that anybody has on that. This is the time to provide it.
I'll give you my feedback. I think it's a great idea. Let's start here, get our waste in the pool and figure out how it's going, and then decide if we're gonna dive in later.
The waste in the pool, that's probably a good way to put how we view it as staff. But I'll say this
So
as
the
well.
accessory, the standalone structures that you just identified is not part of this?
We're recommending as staff that that not be included at this time.
So it wouldn't be legal?
It wouldn't be if things get proposed the way we're suggesting now. And let me say this as well. I don't have a concern with it. I think if done right, it absolutely can be a positive for everybody that's involved. For me, it's more a matter of, I think there are more pressing issues to deal with now.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's-
The examples are way less than 5%
But that would be
community.
a single structure, a single rental unit, not a duplex, not a,
The same, so yes, the way most cities would treat that. In fact, I've kept saying accessory apartment for the most part, which I think connotates the idea that apartment, like basement apartment, right? It's part of that primary structure. A lot of cities have started to, and Kim actually did some research on this last week, and maybe not as many cities as I thought, but the idea of instead of calling it an accessory apartment, you call it an accessory dwelling unit, which is maybe just a little bit, or has a more broad connotation to encompass both an apartment that's in a building and like that guest house that's used by a separate family, but the owner still resides on the property. So it still would be viewed as a single-family dwelling and an accessory use versus duplex or something like
That's
that.
how Salt Lake does it.
I think that's right, yep.
Dave, I have two other questions if I could. Where do building permits fit into this and inspections fit into the plan?
There are limits as to what we can inspect. There are limits relative to what, that's not the right answer to your question. I'm going to back up. We would require people to obtain a building permit for the improvements that they want to make to their home. And with that permit, we would approve plans. And before we would issue an occupancy tied to that permit, the improvements, the work would be inspected and it would be approved. Now, this is just kind of curious, and I don't think this is influencing our decision-making here much at all, but state law limits what we can charge people for when it comes to inspecting, like an accessory apartment or that type of thing. And also today, we don't charge permits for people that want to finish their basements. We stopped doing that probably
really?
10 years ago. It's kind of the same way with fences. We don't charge people for fence permits because we just want them to come in. We don't want there to be any obstacle to get people to come in and to let us inspect it. That's all we really care about. Whether it's a fence and we want to make sure that you get it in the right place so we don't have to come back later and say, tear it out or move it, or it's covering up your electrical with the drywall, which makes it really hard to inspect at that point, and those types of things. So we've really tried to do what we could to remove barriers from people doing things the right way, and I think that's how we look at it with accessory apartments as well. And relative to kind of that overall overhead of maintaining that program, frankly, that's partly where I see that registration fee coming into play. So we would hope that the program could be administered without any other residents in the community subsidizing those that have accessory apartments. So
That'll be part of the plan. Those, what you just described will be part of the plan.
that's what we've talked about so far. Exactly, yeah.
Sounds great.
Is there anything that talks about separate entrance, or that's not part of the requirement?
Nope, not part of the requirement. We've spelled it out. I think
Well,
it
that's
often
nice.
would be the case, but not what we've,
So the landlord can work out, right?
What about short-term rentals, like Airbnb type of stuff? How would this
Can they use
be
it for that
approved or
use?
not for that?
Owner occupied Airbnb.
totally different animal, really. Totally. So today, if you wanted to have the equivalent of an apartment in your basement and use it as an Airbnb, we don't have anything in our regulations that would stop you from doing that. That's an issue that we really haven't addressed yet.
Does this change that at
I
all?
don't think it does.
So right now, in
Wow.
our
So
city,
whether-
that's legal then. In
Whether
our
you're
city,
renting it
that's
out.
fine.
If you're renting it out long-term, like to a family, to where it's a different dwelling unit, I think we would say that's an accessory apartment.
Yes.
If it's a short-term rental that maybe you have listed with, what is it, VRBO, or one of those kind of companies, and I'll let Mr. Snyder weigh in if he views it differently or if I'm missing something there, but that's just an arena from a regulatory perspective that we haven't entered into yet. And someday we might. I know other communities have and continue to deal with it. We haven't had people complain about it, so
I can't see a lot of difference from a requirement standpoint. You still want the parking, You still want it to be safe. You want to know that it's being registered. I don't know why that language couldn't,
Yeah, maybe the only thing, and I'm honestly, I'm not that familiar with the kind of that shared economy and the short-term rental type of a thing. But I think oftentimes they're not necessarily wholly separate apartments, right? I mean, occasionally it's a room or something like that someone's renting on a short-term basis. And trust me, I'll readily admit I might be completely wrong about that. So in some ways, the property actually might be different. You might just be,
less
Room.
requirements, is what you're saying, kind of.
it's really, yeah, I've got an extra bedroom, so I'm going to advertise it for somebody that wants to rent it for a weekend or something.
So right now, as far as you know, it would be totally legal in Spanish Fork right now.
We just wouldn't regulate
Yeah.
And that's it, yeah.
Yeah. No, some cities have taken very,
Short-term rentals, that's a little bit different concept. Most of those are going to be in areas that you would define as destinations. For instance, the housing that's up near the Cottonwood Canyons,
Mhm.
not up the canyons, but right at the mouth of those canyons. Sandy City and Sandy actually may have both of them. But they've had to address those issues because there's some very large homes that are near the mouth of the canyon. Of course, you've got world-class ski resorts on those canyons, so what they've been doing is the owners have been renting out whole 8 rooms to people, and so they've had to regulate. Traditionally, Spanish Fork has yet to
I see,
hit that.
I see.
It's not, you know,
So it might be down the road.
it could be someday. We haven't had the issue come up really as of yet.
Yeah, okay.
That's why we haven't really addressed it.
There's 10 homes in Spanish Fork currently that are on Airbnb. Yeah. Most of them are
Interesting.
just bedrooms.
Yeah, and that's where we see, I mean, I wasn't.
Yeah,
I think that's something that continues to get more and
yeah,
more popular.
For
right?
sure.
Become that way.
yep. Okay, the other question I had was the 8,000 square feet. In the older part of town, 1 or 2 blocks off of Main Street, a lot of those lots are maybe less than 8,000 feet. And there's dwellings that have a basement
Oh, great question.
entrance, and they are being rented out. Under this, if they came forward, they wouldn't be grandfathered because it doesn't meet the criteria, is correct?
No, not correct.
No? That not correct? Okay,
Right.
okay.
We had the other conversation about non-conforming uses, right? So
Uh-huh.
again, maybe just by way of an example, let's say somebody has an accessory apartment located on a 6,000 square foot lot,
Yes,
fairly common size, and they've had it for 20 years,
but it's never been registered, never been,
which they never would have been registered, right? Because we've never
Okay.
had that. But if we can prove that they've been around
okay,
for a certain amount of time,
okay,
and we do that with some regularity. We have a formal process that somebody applies for, charge them $50 to do property research, and oftentimes it's on accessory apartments to determine whether or not the property qualifies to have a legal accessory apartment or whether an existing accessory apartment is legal. And if, among other things, if that use has existed for a long enough period of time, it's a grandfathered
Okay.
vested right.
okay,
Whether they met, for example, or a lot of times, they don't meet our current 10,000 square foot
right,
size. But yet, and we were talking about this just yesterday, related but not exactly the same issue, we've kind of used 1970 as a cutoff point to where if something's been around and in use since 1970, then we know for sure it's grandfathered, because that's kind of when our current zoning regime went into place. It's at least right around there. And any current use that somebody has that we could somehow find to be legal today or vested today, those non-conforming rights would continue forever in perpetuity with that
Wow.
property.
okay,
And in fact, with the 8,000 square feet, Obviously, it's less than 10, so we're hoping that more of them
Yeah,
would be conforming and not non-conforming.
yep, okay. Good answer,
Yeah.
Thank you.
good answer. I like it. I like it. I really can't see many, I mean, especially, you're going to probably want to do the CM presentation next month to really set the groundwork, because I think this is going to filter down a lot of the questions that might just
Yeah.
come up and have to be reiterated anyway. Do you guys concur with that?
And I,
Be good?
you know, Facebook Live, I'm new to that, but I know that's a medium that sometimes gets used to try to have some dialogue with the community and to get the word out.
So are you going to do like this kind of a presentation, Facebook Live?
Exactly. I can't
Okay.
remember if it's next week or the week out. Hey, there it is. So this is our schedule moving forward. So that will be Thursday, May 30th. I was thinking it was sooner than that, confusing it with a different one. And then on the 5th of June, so that's next month, we would hold the formal public hearing with you, formal hearing with the city council, hopefully a couple of weeks after that. And then the idea is that 1st of July, that's go time.
Yeah.
We still have quite a bit of work to do. We've talked about things like the registry and some things like that we need to get up and running. I haven't wanted to dive into that fully until we had a little bit more feedback from you and the city council about the direction we're going in. I think we have enough now that we're probably going to hit that, try to be really ready by the 5th to talk more definitively with you about what we think that would look like and
Okay.
how it would work. And
I'd like to have at least some issues on your registration, how you're going to do that. And a lot more public comment on the R15s and R15s and R112s.
bigger ones.
Yes, absolutely, to let them get their input on it, because I think that's where you're going to get your most public clamor, is from those two areas. You know, I like this, but I've got a lot of questions on it too. I mean, I'd like to do an accessory apartment on my lot to bring my daughter into it, so she's closer to me. But I don't want it attached, I want it to be unattached. So I've got questions on that, and up in Salt Lake, they're doing that. But in another sense, you're putting a lot of, I own fourplexes and stuff like that, and so I see competition with me. And I pay property taxes on my fourplexes, and they don't pay property taxes on an accessory apartment.
You do. I think most, and
It doesn't boost, well, until you show me that the boost is up, then I can
Exactly it.
understand that a little bit, But until you show me that, I would like to know if that affects that or not.
which incidentally, that's a great question. We will research that.
And
see
then
if-
the other things is are you going to have building inspectors go in and inspect them for codes to make sure that their codes are up to date? Because you start putting people into apartments like that, they better be up to codes, and for these people to live, or else if a fire happens, that's overpowered with your electrical and stuff like that, and you have a fire, then who's responsible for that? We've made that point that we've permitted it to happen, and then all of a sudden you have fires and that because you're putting people in places that aren't code, they're violating code violations and stuff. So I want questions on that, on how we're going to do that. And if people, what enforcement are you going to have if people don't register their places? Really, I think they need to have some type of a code so people will register them. I don't care about the $50. I don't care if they even pay $50. But the bottom line is I think they need to be registered, and I think you need to have your inspectors go in and make sure they're up to code. You come back on the older part of town with these 8,000 or less, that a lot of them don't match codes, and you're going to have to sort of look at them a little bit because they've been here for 30, 40, 50 years. I can think of an apartment I rented on Center Street, 40-something years ago. It's still there, still being rented out,
Yeah.
and it sure as suited me because I came down, moved down from Logan to work for the summer, you know, and moved right back up to Logan again afterwards. And it worked for my little family for that summer. But anyway, them are questions I've got that, you know, next month I'd like some answers at least so I can talk about them anyway.
Would it help to have the code enforcement officer here to help answer any of these?
Or the city prosecutor, we could make sure he's here again next month.
But I think that's only fair.
No,
You know,
no,
I think that's only fair that if you're going to let them have the competition, but then the other thing is I would really like these people up there in R112s and R15s to get their input and make sure that there's some letterhead to them or some way that they've got it, because people move into these, you know, they've got rights too. You're saying, oh, these people's got rights to rent their apartments, but these people have got rights. They've moved into these sections to not have that, you know?
hear that, absolutely. yeah.
And so, you know, there's two shoes here that we're talking about, and I would like that input, and, you know, so I don't want to pass something and then all of a sudden have a great big major public clamor. Why did you do that to my neighborhood? You know, I
Well-
want them to understand that this is going on and get their input, and it's just not going to happen here. It's got, you know, there's some way we got to get it to them. And so that's just the questions I've got. And
No, that's good.
Sorry, quick comment we were just talking about. We would be curious to know how the county assessor looks at accessory apartments.
That was gonna be our
What he
research,
brought up.
yeah.
Because the thought is if it's a residential house, you'd have property tax reduction because it's your residential home. Or if you have a secondary home, is it seen that same way?
It is, I can vouch for that, it is, so
if
you
had an
get the
accessory
reduction.
apartment, is it then seen as then a duplex that then maybe see different? I don't know.
I have an accessory apartment. We've had it in our home in Provo for 20 years. We get the residential, I mean, we don't own another property, residential property, so it's our primary place of residence, so we get the 45% reduction. I think, knowing what I know, you know, sometimes you talk to neighbors about what their properties are valued at. So the best guess that I've been able to make over the years is that based on how the county has our home valued compared with some of our neighbors that don't have accessory apartments, that simply is factored into the value of that property. So we're higher than homes that don't in our neighborhood. So it's not like you're paying a separate tax necessarily, but typically it does have
Higher
the
value.
effect of, yeah, causing your property to be valued more highly. But that's a great question. The concept of enforcement, that's something that maybe I glossed over more quickly than I should have. We have an enforcement problem today. It's really significant. We know that in every neighborhood of the city, there are accessory apartments. In my view, we have two options moving forward: change our regulations or enforce the regulations as we have them now. And that's a significant part, I think, of why we're talking about this. Again, it kind of goes back to that.
well, you know,
One of the earlier
here's an
questions.
example. Here's an example. I mean, you have somebody that goes in and builds an accessory apartment it's illegal. It's not in the right place. You know, we don't do anything about it. But yet the person builds a shed back there that doesn't meet code and doesn't meet all this other stuff. And we go in there and we enforce that, make them tear it down and all that other stuff. You know, I mean,
Yeah,
we don't want to throw anybody in jail. And, you know, I just want them to understand that there's things that they can do and things they can't do in our city.
To be consistent.
And be consistent with it, you know? And so there's got to be something in there that states, so everybody can see before they start building what they can do and what they
Dave,
can't do.
I think too, at least for like the Facebook Live meeting and a few other things, I think it's good to emphasize just the housing crisis that's going on right now in the state. I read an interesting article yesterday on KSL talking about what do people do that can't afford to buy a home? They rent, right? But what do people do that can't afford to rent? Where do they go? What happens with them? And rent prices in the last 5 years have skyrocketed. In fact, it said Provo has on average the highest rent in the state right now at $1,400 for a 2-bedroom apartment.
But see, one of the things that happens is the property tax has gone up, you know? And so when property taxes go up, then we have to raise our rent. I mean, where else you got to go? I mean, this is,
No, I agree.
I'm a retired person, and I live on my apartments now. That's where I'm getting my money, is from my apartments. And so if property taxes go up,
You gotta cover
I've
that.
got to do something.
Yeah.
And so so where do I do it? I have to raise my rent. It's just plain and simple, because I still want my cash flow to come into my house. But in another sense, you start throwing all these accessory apartments and stuff like that, then all of a sudden I've got competition, and all of a sudden now I'm going to have to lower my,
But yet your property tax doesn't go down,
that's right.
so,
So see, there's a competition there.
yeah, it's tricky.
And so I want it fair, you know, as a fourplex owner, I want it fair. But then again, you know, I would like to build an accessory apartment, again, on my property, just so I got my daughter there, because she has special needs, her and her son, and I would like her closer. They own a house, but I would like her closer, you know, and so I'm sort of for that. But I am in the R16 zone, so it's legal right now.
But yeah, it talks about just the shortage as well, that there's less than 5% vacancy rate right now along the Wasatch Front for apartments.
I'm
So
surprised it's that high.
Meaning if you are looking for an apartment, of all the apartments available, you're choosing out of less than 5% that are actually available to rent, which means your choices aren't great. The rent can be higher because there's more of a demand. And so I think by passing this, like we've already discussed, right away it opens up that many more options for renters.
That's a great reminder, and I glossed over that whole
And I'm for it.
situation tonight.
As long as it's safe.
Yeah.
As long as we're not putting people in harm's way.
Doesn't this also help?
And making it where they're moving into an
Unsafe.
unsafe area. And so, yeah, anyway.
Does this have the potential of helping, I know that every city has to have a certain amount of low-income housing. If we're able to identify,
Affordable
what's that?
Affordable.
Affordable, excuse me. What'd I say?
Yeah. You don't.
I'm sorry.
You don't said
income. Low
affordable.
income, it's affordable.
I'm with you. I misspoke, but I think the point is cities are struggling with meeting that, and couldn't this help cities by identifying, you know, all of a sudden, let's say we have 500 registered homes. Do they fit into that affordable? Is there a whole nother calculation?
They fit into it.
Okay.
And there are two issues at hand there. One is
Kim?
proving to the state that we've done our part relative to allowing for affordable housing in the community. And there's a formula that we need to use to prove that. In fact, this last legislative session, that changed a little bit, but the concept of accessory apartments, that's part of a palette that we have to choose from now. Meaning it's listed as a
Okay.
menu item that we can choose from. So there's that side of it in terms of wanting to prove that we're good actors as a community and that we're doing our part. And then from my perspective, there's the practical side of it as well, which is that, you know, we're not going to see several hundred apartments, new apartments built in the community in new apartment complexes over the course of the next couple of years. Just likely that's going to happen is very slender, but
Yeah.
we might see several hundred homes adapted to have accessory apartments in them.
Right.
And I think that's been other communities' experience is that this housing deficit that we have right now, I don't honestly think is going to last forever, the way that it is. The market's going to
Correct.
get things back closer to being in equilibrium. But short-term, accessory apartments are the best way to increase the supply of housing. And I think the deficit's enough that I'd be surprised if it, and I'm not trying to predict anything or say that I'm in the know, but looking at what has happened to rents in the last several years, it's hard for me to imagine that adding what I think we'd probably see here, you know, several hundred units to the mix is really going to change that trajectory a lot.
Yeah.
But frankly, the hope is that it would. If
Oh.
people feel like
Enough
rent
cities,
costs have really gotten out
enough
of hand.
cities do it, if enough people make their homes available, yeah, I could change it, but
Right.
take quite a few.
Is there anyone in the audience that came for this meeting that wants to ask a question or make a comment? This is not a public hearing, but would welcome any thoughts that might help us
Come on
along
up.
this.
Come on up.
Well, my concern
Come on up and talk to the microphone.
So we can, people can hear you.
Mr. Davis's concern was one of mine. We moved here, picked out a lot, built a home in what was a single-family dwelling neighborhood, because that's where we wanted to live. I'll bet 50% of the homes in my neighborhood now have accessory units in them. And I don't think the city even realizes they're there. On Saturdays, you just see the pickup truck pull up, a few more 2x4s are hauled in, a little more sheetrock, and then all of a sudden, there's a new family in the neighborhood living in so-and-so's basement. They come with 2 or 3 additional cars, and all their extra stuff that doesn't fit in the garage of the original dwelling, so it's piled off to the side, and so the neighborhood has just become a parking lot and a bunch of junk piled everywhere. And I'm a bit frustrated with that because I tried to keep my property looking nice and that sort of thing, but now I'm living in a neighborhood which is half duplexes. And there's no regulation, there's no monitoring, registration, whatever. The big thing too is parking. They're not providing parking off the street for these units that come in. They all park on the street. The city has an ordinance that says you're supposed to have your cars off the street in the wintertime when there's snow and have the snow plows. That is not enforced. I mean, those cars sit on the street all year long. The snow plows just go around them. Here again, the city has an ordinance that they're not enforcing. It's just a little frustrating. I can understand the need for young families to get into affordable housing. That's wonderful. But I don't know, it's a toss-up. It really is.
Are you more concerned with making more homes available, or is your largest concern just the enforcement? So if this were to pass, they legalized more accessory units.
All of those units would now be
They would now be legal.
legal.
But you're concerned still whether they're
But they
legal
gotta
or
conform-
not.
They gotta conform to this.
So off-street parking, 2 off-street spaces. So your concern is even if this passes, are they gonna enforce that 2-car off-street parking?
Yeah.
So are you concerned with this passing, or are you still mostly concerned with the rules that will be in it not being enforced?
A little bit of both, I guess. Now, the R whatever
R112.
that you say, we're talking more about the southeast part of town, the newer developments with homes coming in. Okay.
The older part of town's an R16 and an R2.
Okay, those numbers I
Yeah,
wasn't.
and so once up there in the southeast and in the southwest, the new portions, them are all 112s and all 115s.
I don't know that you've received much input from the residents of those parts of the city, and it would be interesting to know just how they feel about that.
Yeah.
Right now,
You know?
right now, they're illegal up there. So this would make them legal, but they still have conformed to all this stuff, you know, two units per dwelling, you know, and the minimum size, and they gotta meet their building codes and everything else, and they gotta register, all that stuff's gotta done. So those people that are sitting on the road that are parking, these people are gonna have to build them a spot.
Some type of a spot, yeah.
If they don't have it, then they can't have it.
That's ideally what's going to happen, but I think a lot of the concern is, and this has been my concern too, is if they're illegal, and we know they're illegal, they're still parking there illegally on the street during the wintertime and it's not being enforced, how's this going to change that, and how are people going to be able to trust that now that it's in law,
That's what we
it will
talked
be
about.
enforced? And
That's
so I
what we
think
talked about, the enforcement.
Exactly my
is a big-
concerns.
Yeah.
It's big. You're registering, you've got to register, and then there's got to be an enforcement on it if it's not done.
Home across the street from me was a single-family dwelling. We were too. We're in the part, I think, that's zoned, from what I could tell from the maps when I came to the input session, single family. The family sold the home and moved. A new family moved in immediately. They finished off the basement into an apartment. And now between the two families, we've got 5 cars for that dwelling unit. and they don't have anywhere to park them off the street unless they want to start taking out parts of their yard and doing that.
It's going to have to happen.
Yeah, so just to maintain the looks and the integrity of the neighborhoods that we as residents expected to move into and have remain that way, that's all changing.
That's another issue. I mean, that's an issue, you know, what type of look? I mean, we went up there today, you know, looking up there in Legacy, you know, on the lots and the looks and everything else. Now, you've got that look in your neighborhood, and now you're gonna tear out trees and put parkings and everything else to make an accessory apartment. You know, is that what you want in your neighborhood? There's just a lot of things there.
There's a
that
lot
need
of
be
things
looked
to be
at.
considered.
Yep.
Yeah.
I
thank you.
agree with you.
Thank you for your comments.
If the city, or excuse me, if the planning commission does want to move forward and propose this to the city council at some point, once the kinks are worked out and all the proposed changes, some of my unique perspective, being a younger citizen of the community, might appeal to the city council. You've already covered the affordability part for the renters, but for those of us who were raised in Spanish Fork and want to put down long-term roots, we're coming into maybe buying our first home in a market where even the least expensive homes are costing $300,000 to $350,000, and a lot of us don't have the credit or the savings, and have had the benefit of a slowly, steadily increasing housing market that existed for the last 40 years. Now we're coming into this kind of crazy market where we can't predict what a house is going to cost next year. If we rent for a year or two to try to save up, the increase in housing prices could outpace the savings and just price us out even further. So besides just from a rental standpoint, an ownership standpoint as well, might be a way to look at this in terms of, can young families put down long-term roots in Spanish Fork who want to care for the city and be a part of it until their old age? Is that impossible for them now because there's nothing affordable for them to buy? However, if they have the prospect of, finding a home they can qualify for, and the additional bonus of being able to gain income from the basement, and use that as a period of time, 5, 6, 7 years while they're a young family and saving, to give them a kind of a leg up, and establish some savings and build equity and then move into something, nice or whatever throughout the community. Be a great benefit for those of us who are coming into a housing market that I think everybody is unaccustomed to seeing in Spanish Fork.
Good point.
So Spanish Fork's done a really great job of making it a place that people want to live, but maybe not a place people can live all the time if they want to.
Yep.
You know, when I was a kid growing up, we went through the same thing you did. We had a rent, we saved up our money, finally got our down payment, and was able to buy a home or build a home or whatever. In your day, it's a lot different. This day's a lot different. I mean, the cost of living, the cost of materials every year go up. I mean, monthly. Cost of a lot goes up. Cost of building permits. I mean, everything has gone up to the point where you're right. Somebody your age cannot almost afford. It's gone really crazy. I mean, I know Brad sees it every day, and I see it every day in my construction costs. Concrete goes up. A 2x4 goes up every other day. You don't even know what a piece of rebar. They fluctuate. They drive. Your lots have gone from whatever to this now, because the demand of building and interest rates and everything else is, people are building like crazy and they're taking advantage of the market. Yeah. In a couple of years we might have a crash like we did in 2008, and all those permits will go down and building materials will go down like they did, and all of a sudden we can afford it again. But it's just the nature of the beast of what's going on right now.
Sure.
It truly is, and I feel sorry for you.
I think
It's cheaper if you got the money that you can buy a home. It's almost cheaper to buy a home than it is to rent right now.
Crazy.
It truly is. It's crazy. I just can't believe it. But that's the nature of the beast right now, and it was like that in 2008 until the crash.
I have a couple other points. One is that in areas like the old part of the Spanish Fork, where a lot of these homes maybe be grandfathered or whatever, if they do come out of the shadows, so to speak, and register and find a way to be conforming, people who want to buy these homes as a primary residence, a lot of times could be competing with professional investors, cash buyers, and maybe priced out of those because a cash buyer will see an opportunity to treat it as a duplex, even though according to this, it would be more defined as an accessory dwelling unit. And where there's no enforcement or ability to distinguish between those two right now, you might have a perpetuation of properties that aren't supposed to be used as a duplex because they weren't actually built that way or zoned that way, in perpetuity being used that way. Whereas now, if they come out, they're registered, once they're done that way, it's likely that Spanish Fork can keep those as a primary residence with an ADU rather than it going back into an illegal duplex of some kind where you've got a landlord that rents out both units.
They're not on site.
Sure. And one benefit that I think comes from that is being someone who lives in a home and has an accessory dwelling unit at my house, my primary concern when I look for a tenant, obviously, is the quality of the tenant because I have to live with them, the safety of my children and my wife, and the quality of my property and the relationship that I have to my neighbors in terms of how we care for it. Are greatly impacted by who comes into my basement. So I'm going to be a lot more likely to be very careful about who I bring in. And I think that would overall increase the quality of the rentership that we have in Spanish Fork.
Yep.
So
Good points.
Those are the points that I have to make. So, excuse me, I have to go home and take care of the kids. But thanks for this.
I got one more question, David. So with these accessory apartments, I know I read this in here, but it can only have one other dwelling in it, right? You can't have two. You can't make a threeplex out of a
Single family
You can
unit.
only have, according to what we're doing,
So basically, you live upstairs, you rent your basement, and then you've got an accessory dwelling unit on the side of your house that you're renting. Is that what you're talking about or describing?
something like that, or else somebody comes in and says,
Upstairs.
hey, I got a big enough house that I can finish my basement, but I can also finish my upstairs or have people renting my upstairs. So all of a sudden, you got 3 families in there.
Yeah, good point.
Well, that's an illegal accessory apartment, that, right?
That would be illegal under this
Couldn't
verbiage.
be. That wouldn't even match any of this criteria at all. Because you're talking only one.
Yep. That's lying.
ADU per single
That's the
family.
second one down.
Well, I know a couple of houses in Spanish Fork that are doing exactly that.
Yeah, and so obviously that's a concern.
Huh?
The existing situations where that might exist, that's a concern, but yes, one per property, and this wouldn't necessarily always hold true. I know in other cities' regulations, sometimes they regulate this. I'm not suggesting that we necessarily need to, but we could look into it. Just to reinforce the concept, though, the primary use of the property is the single-family dwelling. So you'd almost think that that's, the part that's owned, that's the main thing. And then you've got this ancillary use that's secondary. By ancillary, a lot of times we mean smaller, less impactful, and that type of thing. That's the accessory apartment or the accessory dwelling unit. So the main thing must be single-family dwelling.
So you can go with the studio apartment, it's only got 1 bedroom, and that goes with, that's an accessory apartment, and nothing else. Can't have 2 studios.
Have 2,
Can't have two.
because that would be.
And we look for things like, well, you have 2 kitchens? You have 2 more kitchens, 2 more laundry rooms?
Yeah.
So
Different
Dave,
things
one
like
of the things I'm hearing that we ought to maybe have a plan ready for next month is how are we going to, let's say we're going to change this and this gets adopted, then how are we going to enforce those that don't want to live by this new and improved? What's the enforcement plan? I think that's something we ought to be ready to discuss next month.
That's gotta be on
That's
the
not too
agenda.
soon.
Also, what's the current penalty for off-street parking in the wintertime? Do we know? Anybody know?
It's a warning, yeah.
And then if they do get a citation is, I want to say,
And to his question, I was going to comment earlier, this year we had a decent amount of inspectors and things go out during our bigger storms and go to our critical areas where it's a driver safety issue, the Oaks, and had them ticket cars, and we had 5, not warnings, but citations given.
So when you ticket a car, does the owner of the vehicle, not the home, But the owner of the vehicle is the one that gets that ticket.
So what happens is the registration information off the plate tells the police officer or the person who's issuing the citation who owns the car. Generally speaking, that person is going to get the citation. So when you come out the next morning or whenever we make the day, they'll see that citation, and then they have a certain amount of time to go to court and either fight it or pay it. If they don't, they get warrants and things like that. These are infractions. Infractions in the state of Utah, you can't go to jail for, however, you can pay up to $750 in fines.
So if you've got a home that you rent out the basement and you don't provide enough parking for your tenants, and they start getting $100 and $150 fines each month, sooner or later they're gonna realize I can't live here and they're gonna move. And then the next renter moves in, same situation. They're just gonna keep cycling through renters or they say, okay.
Or they're gonna
just-
change it and make
With
parking.
this rule, they wouldn't be conforming if they didn't provide
That's
the
right.
proper parking.
That's right.
But you're gonna
Shouldn't
get
that far.
some that are not gonna conform.
Yeah, it shouldn't-
So they
it
would
shouldn't
be
get that far.
Which incidentally, we have, so this is a great discussion, I think, honestly. And the idea that we spend more time talking about how we would anticipate enforcing things, I think that's great for the next meeting. That's gonna be a big part of making this work, and that's gonna cause some pain.
Yeah.
It really is. It's not going to entirely be, it's not gonna be like a kumbaya moment that necessarily makes people think the city's the greatest organization on the planet.
Part of being a
Dave,
law-abiding
Unless
citizen.
you're maybe the neighbor that's next to some of these problem properties. But for example, today we have, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have legal accessory apartments today on properties that don't have 4 parking spaces. So those, those are situations that we'll continue to respect forever. We won't expect them to meet this new standard. They'll be able to play under the rules that have existed historically. So in some cases, we won't be able to do anything about it. But part of what I like about the idea of having the registry and the annual check is that if somebody has a property and we're getting 5 calls, over the course of a couple of months, complaining about them not having enough parking on site, maybe even though they had that parking available when we approved them to start with, they've made changes, however it is, they've got junk cars sitting there that are taking up space or those types of things, they don't necessarily need to stay on the registry, right? And maybe that's a light threat or something like that, but those rights aren't vested in perpetuity unless they conform with the regulations. So that's another, for me, just kind of safety net to hopefully give us some capacity to make sure that problem properties can be dealt with.
One thing I was going to say on the parking, it doesn't show it right there, but in the detail, there's some line stricken through, like the ability to stack cars. That's now going to be acceptable. So picture a home that's in this gentleman's neighborhood that's got a 2-car garage to begin with, okay? Well, he's probably got 2 stalls outside of the garage. So already he's got 4 stalls, right? And he might even have a long driveway on the side of the house because you can stack them and count them. I don't think the parking is going to be the bigger issue as far as showing that you've got the room, the way this is worded. I think the bigger issue is, yes, I've got the room, but nobody's parking there, they're parking in the road.
Yeah, 'cause nobody wants to shuffle cars.
But because you can shuffle them, because you can park them like that, that really opens the door to make more of these legal. Does that make sense? And even if they didn't have that side driveway, if they can just show the 2 in the garage and 2 outside the garage, that conforms, right? According to this. Yeah, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but I think the byproduct is people will be parking in the street because they don't want to go out and shuffle cars.
Yeah. One thing that I think is kind of curious, and I'm not trying to lobby to go one direction or another necessarily, we talk about like the R112 and the R115 zones. And again, we've only allowed single-family dwellings in those zones ever. But frankly, I think we get fewer complaints about accessory apartments in those zones than other places through different channels. We know they're there. But I think part of the reason that we get fewer complaints is because you've got bigger lots, more lot width. I think it's easier to have an accessory apartment discreetly, to where tenants aren't parking in front of neighbors' homes and some different things like that. Because really, those properties actually are set up to accommodate that additional use a little bit better than, there's some subdivisions we could drive through. I'll use the Jex subdivision, one of the first subdivisions in the city. You're talking about homes that were built, I think, late 70s, early 80s, predominantly maybe 8,000 square foot lots. But there I sort of scratch my head about, man, how do you provide the off-street parking and that sort of thing to make it work there? So those are actually the areas that I'm the
More
most concerned about, not probably some of the places where there's just more space to work with.
Overall, I think there's been a lot of tough issues addressed. I think the staff's done a great
And
job.
I don't think we're pretending at all that this is perfect, but I do think we're trying to balance everything as best as we can to make something that works for as many people as possible.
Okay, well, this was good discussion, even though it wasn't, a public hearing and stuff. It'll give us some, I think, some help to address it and answer questions. I think there were some action items that you took in note of. I think one of them was property values, if they was going to do a little research on that. And then I think another one was enforcement. How did you feel about maybe having one of the city inspectors here to, you mentioned that he sees so many different scenarios from a home that's 1970 to the one that's 10 years old, and how he might approach that from an inspection standpoint.
Right.
So I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
have him here or not, but.
No, and our building official, he feels left out that he doesn't get invited to more of these meetings.
Yeah, let's have him here,
He'd love to be here.
okay?
And, I appreciate all of the different topics that you've brought up, and I think we'll be ready to talk more about them.
Sounds good. You'll have security here as well.
I have to say this, we posted things on Facebook. Scott Aylett, he's our PIO, he did that, I think it was 2 weeks ago. I really expected to be answering the phone a lot
Yeah.
here this past week. It's been quiet. Maybe that should make me nervous.
Well, I think you've reached out and we've had, 3 different
Yeah.
focus groups
Yeah.
and
Maybe people feel
conversation.
like they've been heard.
Discussion fatigue is a real thing. Maybe people are just tired of talking about it too. Could be.
Okay, well, thank you, Dave and
Thank you.
staff.
Appreciate you guys.
Appreciate it. Nothing else on the agenda? I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll motion we adjourn.
Okay. And I don't even think we need to vote for it. We just need to vote.
Hey, Clint,